Hey, I'm Jake Lizio, and welcome to part 2 of my lesson on suspended chords. In this video, we're going to be covering some of the things that you may confuse for suspended chords, some things that are related to suspended chords, but more importantly, dealing with composition and some of the problems that may arise when you start working with this kind of stuff. To start off, in my last video, I mentioned that if you're on the 4 chord, then you can't really play a sus4 chord because it'll add in a note that's out of the key. So for example, in the key of A major, if I go to my 4 chord D and if I try to make it sus4, it brings in this note G. And that can be a problem. And I just want to demonstrate to you how that can be a problem, because it might sound great all on its own, right? If I play an A sus4 and a D sus4, this sounds awesome. So what am I doing telling you can't play it? Well, you certainly can play it, but if you do, you should really know what the consequences of that are. Here's how I'd like to demonstrate this. Let's say I've got a little song I wrote that goes like this, from an A major to a D major. And let's say I've got some lyrics and a melody on top of that that sounds like this. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. Sounds all right. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. Now let's say I spiced up that chord progression by adding in some sus4 chords like this. This still sounds great, but now when I add my vocal melody on top, listen to what happens during that last measure. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. Do you hear that clashing? Listen again. But I keep falling down. So what's going on here is that my chord, D sus4, has an A and a G in it, but my melody is singing a G sharp. So we've got this little chromatic cluster right there that to my ear sounds really bad. This is the kind of thing that you might hear a beginning composer get away with and not really notice that it doesn't sound bad. But to my ears, it's unlistenable. So here's what we could do to fix that. Our first option is to, instead of playing a D sus4, let's just play a D sus2, because that would introduce an E note, and E is not out of key. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. Or you could introduce a concept known as a suspended sharp 4. A normal suspended 4 chord is just a root, a fourth, and a fifth, but if you did a root, a sharp 4, and a fifth, you could call that a D sus sharp 4. And even though technically that's not a name, I'm fine with people using that name because it really spells out what the chord should be. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. Another solution I would have here is to just change my melody so it actually accommodates that G note. Now it's like my melody is in mixolydian because I'm using all the notes of A major, but I have a flatted 7th instead. But I keep falling down, but I keep falling down. And since I actually like the way that sounds, I'm going to try to amplify this mixolydian flavor by making my tonic chord an A7 instead. I tried to move, but I keep falling down. So you are free to use these sus2 and sus4 chords everywhere, but you just need to be aware of the notes that you're adding in there and how they're going to affect your original key. Sometimes it's going to create little problems like this that you might not notice, and if you start stacking harmonies on top of something that you didn't quite work out, you can end up in a lot of trouble because you didn't do the harmonic math early on. Now I'd like to explore a little bit more of the classical aspects of the suspended chord. I am by no means an expert in classical harmony, but one of the quick ways that I have to getting into that world is by using the sus chords off of the 5 position. So let's say I'm in the key of A, my dominant chord is E major, right? And we've already mentioned that it's pretty common to see a sus4 chord there on the dominant that takes you back to our tonic. But some of the weirder classical chords like the Neapolitan chord or the augmented 6th chords, I really wasn't able to use those chords until I was able to follow them up with that sus4 on the dominant. So here's a good example. The Neapolitan chord is this weird obscure chord where you take the flatted 2, all right? So if I'm in the key of A, the flatted 2 is B flat. And you invert it, all right? So now I've got a B flat over D, and this to me is like a useless chord. For the longest time, I had no idea what to do with it. It wasn't until I started following this useless chord up with the 5 chord that was suspended to help pull me back to my tonic that I started getting a little bit of that classical flavor. You know, classical harmony was always outside of my range as a rock player and a blues player, but you know, just by playing around with that 5 position and some of those weirder chords to take you there, you can hear how nice it starts getting a little bit more archaic. Also in minor keys, if I'm in the key of A minor, that same movement will work. So I've got a D flat or a B flat over D, and then E sus4, back to A minor. So that's a very traditional approach to looking at suspended chords, but you can use that in a very non-traditional fashion. A few years back, I wrote a really silly funk song called The Immaculate Gyration.
It's my first time on the dance floor. It's my first time boogie down.
And the progression there was basically the key of F sharp minor. And if I'm in the key of F sharp minor, then the Neapolitan chord would be a G over B. So I bring in that G over B just to help us resolve to a C sharp sus4, C sharp major, and then back to F sharp minor. And it was a great way to add a lot of harmonic interest to that verse section.
Well, you know, baby, I'm gonna dance on the floor. You know that, baby, all I want is more. 'Cause I dance it.
Now on the electric guitar, what you'll see a lot is a power chord, a root and a fifth, and you'll see the ninth added in afterward with the pinky. And this is a really lovely shape. You slide it around to different positions. You just ignore key for a little while and just kind of think about using it as a power chord. You can get some really cool like math rock sounds out of it. But even though it has all the notes of a suspended 2, it almost never functions like a suspended 2. It doesn't really resolve anywhere. So I like to think of it as just like a ninth power chord or a suspended power chord, even though that's not a thing. Now speaking of ninths, it's pretty common to see something like a sus2 or a sus4, but the third is actually still there, and that means it's no longer suspended. Now it's an add 9 chord or an add 11 chord. So for example, A major is an A and a C sharp and an E, and that 2 was B. So if I add that 2 in, and if I add it in an octave higher, we would just call it a ninth, then we get A major add 9, which sounds like that. It's hilariously bright, really nice chord. I think of it as the good morning chord. You can make it the good night chord just by strumming it backwards. Good night. Also, if you do this in a minor position as well, so A, C, and E is a minor triad, and if we keep that second note in there, or call it a ninth, we get A minor add 9. Awesome chord, very dark, much darker cousin of just a regular A minor chord. And similarly, if you have a 1, 4, 5, and the third is still present, we can consider that an add 4 or an add 11 chord. And you can think of it something like this. Here's all the notes of an A major chord with an added fourth. And then here's all the notes of an A minor chord with an added fourth. And you can think of those as A major add 11 or A minor add 11. Now the voicings here are a little funky on the guitar. Something like this is going to work out much better on the piano, where you can get access to those intervals a little easier. Now lastly, I'd like to talk about 7th suspended 2 or 7th suspended 4 chords. If you have the notes of a dominant 7th chord, so a 1, a 3, a 5, and a flatted 7, just replace that third with the second or the fourth, and you'll have a 7th suspended 2 or a 7th sus 4. So if you think of everybody's favorite song, Wonderwall, that's an E minor 7, a G major, a D sus 4, and then an A7 with a sus 4. Because I've got my A and I've got that's my root, I've got my fifth, I also have my fourth note, which is a D, and I have a flat 7, which is G. And you can hear the context of this chord very open. It's a very vast chord, but it has a little bit more color than just a suspended 4 all on its own, I think. Also in the song, Here Comes the Sun, I don't have my capo, so right now it's going to be in the key of D, but at the end of the choruses, or at the end of the verses, we have an A7 that turns into all the suspended variations. And once again, it's still got all that movement, all that stuff that we've associated with suspended, but a little bit more grit to it, a little bit more color to it because of the presence of that flat 7. Now you may notice these notes are indistinguishable from the notes of a minor 7th suspended chord. They'd contain the exact same notes, so that's why that chord name really doesn't exist. We can look at a major 7th suspended chord, but things get a little weird there too. If we look at the notes of an A major 7 suspended 4, then you'll realize it's just the notes of an E major chord, except it's all being played over an A note. So it's like an E major with an added fourth. So I don't really think it's necessarily too helpful all the time to be thinking of major 7 suspended 4 chords, but occasionally that name does pop up and you just want to be aware of what that chord label means. So it's kind of funny in my opinion, one of the first chords that everybody learns is this D sus 2 and this D sus 4 on the guitar, and it seems like really simple stuff, and it is, but hopefully these 2 videos kind of give you the idea. It can be really gory, and depending on how far you want to go with this stuff and how much you want to understand about layering and how it all works together, there's a lot to explore when it comes to just these simple suspended chords. So I hope you enjoyed these videos and I hope you learned something from them. If you did enjoy these videos, then you have to thank my Patreon supporters for making it possible. If you'd like to join them, you can. There's links below in the description. Otherwise, you could support this channel by buying my ultimate modal poster. There's links below in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.